It was a quiet October evening in Ouagadougou, the kind of stillness that usually comes before something historic breaks the silence. Above the capital, a lone helicopter circled, its sound swallowed by the thick West African dusk. On the ground, an unmarked convoy moved slowly toward the presidential palace of Kuluba. Inside the walls of power, a meeting was about to take place, one that few global headlines noticed, but whose significance could echo across an entire continent. Two men, shaped by different generations and different nations, were about to sit down to talk about one idea: the true liberation of Africa. On one side was Captain IbrahimTraoré, the young leader of BURKINAFASO, a soldier-turned-statesman who had captured the imagination of millions across the Sahel. On the other sat Jacob Zuma, the former president of South Africa, once a close companion of Nelson Mandela, now a vocal elder in the Pan-African struggle. Their handshake was not simply diplomatic, it was symbolic. It marked the convergence of memory and momentum, of a past that had fought for freedom, and a present still questioning if that freedom had ever fully arrived. Across Africa, many believe the era of colonialism ended decades ago, but these two men dared to ask a different question. What if independence was never complete? What if flags changed, but the hands that controlled resources, dictated policies, and defined the future still lived elsewhere? Jacob Zuma came not with a formal agenda, but with a warning and perhaps a blessing. The colonizers still believe our wealth belongs to them, he said bluntly. Let us now say, enough is enough. Captain Traore did not need convincing. His leadership had already sent shockwaves through traditional alliances, disrupted foreign military arrangements, and reclaimed narratives about who gets to speak for Africa. This was not just a meeting between two presidents. It was a moment of ideological handoff from one who had fought apartheid to one now resisting neocolonialism through sovereignty, resource control, and a bold new regional vision. And if you stay until the end of this story, you will understand why what happened behind those palace doors could be the beginning of something far larger than Burkina Faso, something that might redraw the political destiny of the continent itself. Long after the colonial flags were lowered and the last European governors left African soil, a more subtle force took their place. It did not wear uniforms or carry bayonets. It came instead in the form of contracts, currencies, and conditional partnerships. This was neocolonialism, a system that promised independence but delivered dependence by new means. Captain IbrahimTraoré and Jacob Zuma understand this system intimately. To them, the issue was never just who governed the land, but who controlled what lay beneath it and who shaped the rules of development above it. In their eyes, neocolonialism is not a metaphor. It is the continued extraction of Africa's wealth, disguised as cooperation. Neocolonialism operates through three main levers: financial control, military dependency, and intellectual domination. First, many African countries remain tied to financial structures inherited from their former colonizers. The CFA franc, for example, is still pegged to the euro and managed through French institutions, affecting the monetary policies of multiple West African nations. Loans from international institutions, often celebrated as lifelines, come with strings that dictate national budgets. Second, security remains a tool of influence. Foreign troops on African soil, often welcomed under the banner of anti-terrorism, have too often blurred the line between partnership and occupation. Military bases, surveillance programs, and weapon contracts have made some African armies reliant not on national strategy, but foreign approval. Third, control over narratives and knowledge. Western media, education systems, and NGOs often define what progress looks like for Africa. They shape public discourse, dictate development priorities, and label any alternative path as dangerous or anti-democratic. For leaders like Traore, This is the most insidious form of control. It colonizes the mind before it colonizes the land. The impact: a continent rich in resources but poor in ownership. Nations flooded with aid but starved of autonomy. Leaders elected but constrained. And populations told they are free yet unable to change the very systems that keep them dependent. When Zuma says, "They believe our wealth belongs to them," and Traore echoes, "They keep us in a state of permanent war," they are naming the architecture of neocolonialism, not just as past grievance, but as present structure. To them, true liberation cannot happen until Africa controls its own currencies, secures its own lands, sets its own narratives, and defines its own future without asking for permission. That's what brought them together. Not nostalgia, not ceremony, but a shared urgency to tear down the invisible empire still draped across the continent. To understand the political fault lines of today's Africa, you must understand Captain IbrahimTraoré. At just 35 years old, he has become one of the most watched and controversial figures on the continent, not because he seeks attention, but because he challenges the very framework of how African nations relate to the world. For Traoré, sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a restructuring of reality. In speech after speech, he has declared that Burkina Faso will no longer be a client state, no longer a battlefield managed by foreign generals, and no longer a vault of wealth siphoned abroad. His voice cuts through the usual diplomatic fog with a clarity that both inspires and unnerves. Africa's soul, he says, resides in its soil, its people, and in the unyielding drive for sovereignty. This is not abstract language. Traoré speaks the language of minerals, of borderlands, of blood and infrastructure. His policies have removed foreign military bases, terminated certain defense agreements, and introduced national control over key mining operations. Each of these moves was more than a technical shift. They were declarations of self-determination. But perhaps what sets Traoré apart most is not what he opposes, but what he envisions. He sees a Sahel that does not merely survive, but leads, a region not framed by crisis, but defined by coordination and strength. His efforts to build the alliance of Sahel states AES, a coalition with Mali and Niger, represent a bold attempt to redraw not just borders, but mental maps. This alliance, based on mutual security and shared economic goals, is designed to stand outside traditional Western-dominated institutions like ECOWAS or the CFA zone. Critics call him radical. Supporters call him necessary. What is clear is that he has reignited a political language long suppressed, the language of African dignity, of saying no without fear, of breaking contracts not written in the people's interest. In Traoré's worldview, liberation is not something granted. It is seized and then guarded with vigilance. He has been compared to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary former leader of Burkina Faso, and sometimes framed as his spiritual successor. But Traoré is not trying to relive the past. He is trying to prevent its repetition. The betrayal of African independence in the 20th century happened not because colonizers refused to leave, but because their influence was allowed to remain. That, in his mind, must end now, not next year, not with another summit, now. To understand the political fault lines of today's Africa, you must understand Captain IbrahimTraoré. At just 35 years old, he has become one of the most watched and controversial figures on the continent, not because he seeks attention, but because he challenges the very framework of how African nations relate to the world. For Traoré, sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a restructuring of reality. In speech after speech, he has declared that Burkina Faso will no longer be a client state, no longer a battlefield managed by foreign generals, and no longer a vault of wealth siphoned abroad. His voice cuts through the usual diplomatic fog with a clarity that both inspires and unnerves Africa's soul, he says, resides in its soil, its people, and in the unyielding drive for sovereignty. This is not abstract language. Traore speaks the language of minerals, of borderlands, of blood and infrastructure. His policies have removed foreign military bases, terminated certain defense agreements, and introduced national control over key mining operations. Each of these moves was more than a technical shift, they were declarations of self-determination. But perhaps what sets Traore apart most is not what he opposes, but what he envisions. He sees a Sahel that does not merely survive, but leads, a region not framed by crisis, but defined by coordination and strength. His efforts to build the alliance of Sahel states AES, a coalition with Mali and Niger, represent a bold attempt to redraw not just borders, but mental maps. This alliance, based on mutual security and shared economic goals, is designed to stand outside traditional Western-dominated institutions like ECOWAS or the CFA zone. Critics call him radical. Supporters call him necessary. What is clear is that he has reignited a political language long suppressed the language of African dignity, of saying no without fear, of breaking contracts not written in the people's interest. In Traore's worldview, liberation is not something granted. It is seized and then guarded with vigilance. He has been compared to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary former leader of Burkina Faso, and sometimes framed as his spiritual successor. But Traore is not trying to relive the past. He is trying to prevent its repetition. The betrayal of African independence in the 20th century happened not because colonizers refused to leave, but because their influence was allowed to remain. That, in his mind, must end now. Not next year, not with another summit, now. Jacob Zuma has spent decades in the trenches of African politics, first as a fighter in the liberation struggle against apartheid, later as president of South Africa, and now, unexpectedly, as a traveling elder in the reawakening of Pan-African identity. In October 2025, he arrived in Burkina Faso not as a diplomat, but as a witness to what he called the next chapter of Africa's unfinished liberation. At the steps of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, Zuma stood beside Captain Traore and offered more than pleasantries. He offered solidarity. "I came here," he said, "because what Burkina Faso is doing is remarkable. We must now ask ourselves how we, together, can continue the struggle for the liberation of Africa." This was no ordinary endorsement. Zuma's presence carried the weight of history, of having walked beside Nelson Mandela, of having survived exile, prison, and the brutal logic of colonial governance. His voice, gravelly with age and experience, lent moral gravity to the ambitions of a much younger leader. But it also carried its own agenda to remind Africa that the chains of colonization have changed shape, not disappeared. Zuma has long spoken out about the persistence of economic colonialism, particularly through multinational corporations, currency regimes, and foreign legal structures that continue to bind African nations to their former rulers. "We may fly our own flags," he once remarked, "but many of our decisions are still made in rooms where we are not invited." As the head of the MK Party, a political movement with roots in South Africa's armed struggle, Zuma has sought to reframe political discourse around sovereignty, land, and historical redress. His messaging resonates deeply in communities that feel left behind by globalization and betrayed by post-independence elites. In Burkina Faso, Zuma saw a reflection of a struggle he once fought, but this time, the battlefield is not apartheid, it is debt, dependency, and the quiet erosion of self-rule. In Traore, he recognized not just a fellow rebel, but a continuity of defiance. Their meeting symbolized something few leaders ever get to witness: the passing of a torch not in ceremony, but in conviction. The conviction that Africa's problems are not inevitable, that what was stolen can be reclaimed, that what was signed under pressure can be undone by will, and above all, that the struggle did not end with flags and anthems. It simply changed language, and now it must be answered with action. Though separated by age, geography, and political background, Jacob Zuma and IbrahimTraoré share a striking ideological alignment. Their bond is not based on shared biography, but on a shared reading of history and a common vision of how it must be rewritten. Zuma. Forged in the fires of South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle, spent decades fighting against visible chains, Traore, rising from the Sahel's turmoil, confronts chains that are less visible but just as binding, embedded in economics, diplomacy, and security doctrines. One fought for political independence, the other now fights for what that independence never fully delivered: sovereignty in practice, not just on paper. At the heart of both men's worldview lies a refusal to accept Africa's current condition as natural or inevitable. They believe that the continent's underdevelopment is not accidental, it is structured, and that structure can only be dismantled through solidarity, self-determination, and the courage to reject external definitions of progress. Their meeting in Ouagadougou was more than symbolic. It was a moment of ideological convergence. When Zuma praised Burkina Faso's direction, he wasn't just supporting Traoré, he was signaling a deeper hope that the fight he and others began in the 20th century could find new life in leaders willing to challenge today's empire of influence. Traoré, in turn, did not merely welcome Zuma out of courtesy. He understood the power of continuity. By embracing a figure tied to Mandela's legacy, he anchored his present movement in a lineage of struggle, one that stretches from Soweto to Sankara. Together, they presented a rare image in African politics, a generational handshake, not of nostalgia, but of renewal. A reminder that liberation is not a finished project but a living idea, passed from one voice to the next until it becomes action. And in that handshake, the question echoed: can a continent once freed politically now be freed economically, culturally, and psychologically? For these two men, the answer is not just yes, it's urgent. The meeting between Traoré and Zuma did not go unnoticed by the wider world. In fact, it landed like a ripple across diplomatic circles, from the corridors of ECOWAS and the African Union to the offices of policy analysts in Brussels, Paris, and Washington. For some, it was a symbol of hope. For others, it was a signal of disruption. Western governments responded with caution. The European Union reiterated its concern over what it sees as a democratic regression in the Sahel and warned that shifting military alliances could compromise regional stability. Human rights organizations questioned Traoré's consolidation of power and expressed alarm over shrinking civic space. The United States, while measured in tone, emphasized the importance of constitutional order and free expression. These criticisms, though predictable, reflect a deeper unease that a new model of African governance is emerging, one that does not seek approval from traditional powers. The Burkina Faso-Zuma dialogue reminded many that Africa's future may be forged outside the usual scripts and summits. Within Africa, the reactions were more complex. ECOWAS leadership expressed regret over Burkina Faso's withdrawal, yet maintained open channels for dialogue. The African Union, balancing diplomacy and principle, called for inclusive political transitions while recognizing the right of member states to determine their paths. But perhaps most striking was the response from ordinary Africans. On social media, hashtags like African Liberation and We're All Traore trended across platforms. In cities from Dakar to Johannesburg, small but passionate gatherings voiced solidarity. To them, this was not about geopolitics, it was about dignity. They saw in Traoré and Zuma not perfection, but defiance, not ideology, but action, and that action reclaiming agency, breaking dependency, and challenging an inherited order struck a chord across generations. For every critic abroad, there seemed to be a supporter at home, and that tension between external caution and internal conviction is what now defines the new African discourse. Whether one agrees or disagrees, one thing is clear: the winds are shifting. Liberation is a word Africa knows well. It has been sung in anthems, painted on murals, and etched into the speeches of generations. But in the silence that followed the fireworks of independence, another question began to emerge: liberation from what and toward what? The meeting between Jacob Zuma and IbrahimTraoré did not offer all the answers, but it did ask the right questions. Questions about who controls African wealth, who defines African progress, who benefits when Africa is told to be patient, pragmatic, or polite. Zuma brought to that room the memories of a continent that once broke its chains. Traore brought the resolve to make sure those chains do not return in new forms dressed in the language of aid, reform, or foreign partnership. Together, they embodied a warning that Africa's political freedom, without economic and psychological freedom, is incomplete. And yet, they also carried something deeper: hope. Hope that the continent's future need not be written in the offices of foreign ministries or the boardrooms of extractive industries. Hope that sovereignty is not a luxury, but a necessity. And hope that even in the face of global skepticism, African leaders can still say no and mean it. As they stood shoulder to shoulder in Ouagadougou, the cameras captured more than protocol. They captured continuity. A torch passed not through ceremony, but through shared conviction. Two men from different eras, united by belief that Africa deserves more than survival, it deserves direction. In the days that followed, young people in cities and villages alike reposted the images, debated the meaning, and reimagined what African unity might look like when rooted in action, not just aspiration. And that is perhaps the greatest legacy of their encounter: it has reopened the door to imagination. Because Africa's greatest struggle today is not only against poverty or conflict, it is against the idea that nothing can change, that dependency is destiny, that the script cannot be rewritten, but it can. And if you followed this story to the end, you've already taken a step toward that rewriting. You've listened, considered, and remembered. And that, too, is an act of resistance. So share this story, reflect on it, talk about it, because every time you do, you help ensure that Africa's second liberation will not be silent. And you, yes, you become part of the voice that refuses to forget.